Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or ETI. We'll be talking about the SETI Institute, which has been searching for ETI since the mid-1980s. They do this by scanning the heavens with radio telescopes, looking for signals that seem to come from an intelligent source. With me in the studio is Seth Shostak, senior astronomer at the SETI Institute. Seth has a PhD in astronomy from Caltech. He's written hundreds of articles on popular science topics. He co-authored a college textbook on astrobiology. He's a frequent lecturer on scientific issues. He won the 2004 Klumpke-Roberts Award from the Astronomical Society of the Pacific for his contributions to the public understanding of astronomy, and he's the host of the SETI Institute's radio show Big Picture Science, which is heard on over 30 radio stations as well as on the internet. Seth, exactly how do you look for extraterrestrial intelligence? What do you really do?
Well, you have to ask yourself, if there are intelligent beings on another world, around another star, how might they make themselves known? Now, one thing you could consider doing is just go visit them or wait for them to visit us. That doesn't turn out to be very practical. But there are other things that might be practical, like, as you mentioned, trying to eavesdrop on radio broadcasts that are coming our way, much as was done in the movie Contact. And that's the kind of thing we do. There are other things you could do. You could look for big engineering projects in space. That's another way to approach the problem.
But the main thing is listening on these radio telescopes, right?
That's what we do mostly. There are other experiments being run where they look for flashing lights in the sky. You know, maybe the aliens are wielding big lasers and occasionally aiming one in our direction. You know, you'd see a flash in the sky if you had a sensitive enough telescope and a receiving setup. So that's a perfectly legitimate approach.
We actually have a video that shows some of your radio telescopes. We're going to show that. In fact, why don't we go ahead and run that video right now? There's no soundtrack on it, so we can just talk over it and we can discuss what we're looking at. Okay, so there are some telescopes. Where is this located, by the way?
Well, this is what's called the Allen Telescope Array, because the money to build it was contributed by Paul Allen, co-founder of Microsoft. Yeah.
Right.
And this is located in Hat Creek, California. Most viewers won't know where that is, but it's up in the Cascade Mountains. If you go up to Redding, for example, up the Central Valley to Redding, then you make a right turn and go for an hour and a half into the Cascades, into the mountains there, you'll find Hat Creek. We located it there not because the scenery is beautiful, albeit it is, and not because of the cuisine, which is adequate, but simply because it's very radio quiet there. The mountains shield these antennas from all the interference coming from the Bay Area.
Now, why do you need multiple antennas? Are they all looking in a different place in the sky?
You can do that. You can aim them each in their own direction if for some reason you want to, cover a big chunk of this sky. In general, however, we are using them as a team. They're all aimed in the same direction, and they just collect as much cosmic static, if you will, as they can. By having lots of them, you have more sensitivity.
So there's a person, so you can see the scale of the telescope compared to a person.
You could put one of these in your backyard here in Palo Alto, for example. You might incur the wrath of your neighbors for this unsightly structure, but it isn't all that huge. The big dish is about 20 feet in diameter.
So that looks like a technician making a slight adjustment there?
Yes, indeed. That's the point of focus for the antenna. That's actually where the cosmic static comes in. That's where the rubber meets the road, if you will. And of course, inside a small house there are banks of computers, a lot of electronics. It's a typical experiment in modern science.
So how do you know what frequency to look for? Because the electromagnetic spectrum has a virtually infinite number of frequencies. There's a lot of stuff to look for. Where do you aim?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And indeed, the aliens have not been good enough to tell us where on the dial to tune. So you have to sort of second guess them. Now, a few things get ruled out right away at very low frequencies. When I say low frequencies, I mean like the frequencies of television broadcasts. For us, that's a low frequency. Are probably not so good because, to begin with, there's a lot of interference on Earth. And those low frequencies actually don't go through the gas and dust of space terribly well. Very high frequencies have other problems. But it turns out that sort of the middle of the radio dial, what's called the microwave spectrum. Microwave, the same wavelengths you use to cook leftovers in your kitchen. Those frequencies actually go right through space like a knife through butter, and they also come right through the atmosphere of the Earth. So we tend to look at those frequencies.
Now, what are you actually looking for? How would you differentiate an intelligent signal from a routine, non-intelligent one?
Yeah, well, that's a good question because, of course, space makes a lot of radio noise. right? There are entire cadres of astronomers who spend their day jobs, or their entire time actually, studying the natural cosmic static from the universe, quasars and pulsars. Jupiter makes a lot of radio noise. The sun makes a lot of radio noise. So how do you separate that out? Well, the trick is this. If you find a signal that's only really at one spot on the dial, that's not nature. Nature can't engineer that. That's the mark of a transmitter. So that's what we look for. We're not looking for,
the signal stays at one place.
It's at one spot on the dial, and it stays there. Right? That tells you it's a transmitter. It doesn't tell you what they're saying. That's a different question. But it does tell you, well, we don't know what it is, Bob, but it's an artificially built transmitter.
Have you ever found any signals or anything that might be a potential candidate to be what
we find signals all the time, Marty. If you're sitting there at the telescope watching the screens, you will see a signal. Every 10 seconds, there'll be a new signal.
But the kind of signals that you're looking for.
Well, they are the kinds of signals you're looking for because they are these narrowband signals at one spot on the dial. However, we follow up on them immediately, within a few minutes. Okay, and then it turns out they all go away because what those signals turn out to be are, radio signals coming from maybe the radar sets at the local airport, or a very large source of interference, because that's what we consider it, are the telecommunication satellites that are orbiting the Earth. Right? You want, to be able to make a phone call to Europe. Well, there are satellites that are relaying those signals, and those satellites produce a lot of signal in our antennas.
Now, are you aiming at any specific point in the sky? Are there some areas that seem more promising than others, more likely to find habitable planets?
Well, we think so. I mean, of course, we don't know. We don't know where the aliens are hanging out, but we make rather conservative assumptions in general. To begin with, you search around stars that might have planets. Now, we don't know that many stars that have planets. We know, as of today, on the order of maybe 500, 600. A lot more are being discovered as we sit here and will be announced over the course of the next couple of years. But even so, the number is going to be thousands, a few thousand.
Now, I understand that the Kepler mission has vastly increased the number of planets that are considered candidates for habitation.
Well, there are planets in the so-called habitable zone of the stars. That is to say, they're at the right distance from their star so that they're not too hot, not too cold, and maybe you could have liquid oceans and that sort of thing. Obviously, those are very high-quality candidates. You would look in those directions. But, the bottom line is this. If you're going to find ET, you can't just look at a few hundred or a few thousand star systems, even if you know they have planets. That's not good enough. You could have turned an antenna on Earth, right, for 4.5 billion years and not picked up a single radio signal from it because, as it turns out, the dinosaurs did not build radio transmitters. So you really have to look at a very long list. And so we try and do that. We try and look at as many star systems as we can.
I'm interested in the Kepler mission because I've heard that it's identified a lot of planets that might be candidates. Also, we have some slides from the Kepler mission, which I'm anxious to show our audience. So let's go ahead and take a look at those slides. Can we see the first slide about the Kepler mission? Okay, so there it is. So they're putting the Kepler satellite together, and those are picture elements, I think something similar to what you might have in a regular video camera.
Right, those are the CCDs. It's a whole array of CCDs, exactly the sort of a chip you might have in the back of your digital camera. These are very high-quality ones and very big ones. But what happens is those form a camera, because there's a big mirror in the telescope, and it's focused on those chips. It's a big camera that's aimed at a part of the sky. It's in the constellation of Cygnus, largely, and it just stares at 150,000 stars, the ultimate staring contest. And thanks to those chips, it can measure the brightness of each of those stars every 30 seconds.
Now we have a second slide. Let's see the second slide. Okay, so that is the Kepler satellite itself. And I believe it's in orbit around the sun, not the Earth.
Yeah, it's trailing the Earth. Well, the idea is to get the Earth out of the sky of this thing so it doesn't block the view of Kepler. So it follows the Earth around the sun a little bit. But indeed, that's it. It's just a telescope in space, like so many other telescopes in space. But as I say, this one has a very specific mission. Its job is to measure the brightness of 150,000 stars for years, just staring at them. Some of them, if they have planets, those planets will get in front of the star occasionally. Just the way if you looked at the sun from the right directions, you would see the Earth get in front of the sun every 365 days, right? And you would see a slight diminution in the light coming from the sun.
So that's how they tell the planet is there when the sun dims. And I think we have one more slide. So that's a picture of the Milky Way galaxy. And that yellow area is the area that Kepler is searching in.
Mm-hmm.
So since we're located on one of the spiral arms of the galaxy, it's looking toward the base of the spiral arm because I think that's where there's a greater density of stars.
Yeah, well, it's been chosen to be sort of a representative area of the galaxy with a high number of stars in the field of view, indeed.
Now let me ask you this. I know that you're listening for signals. Are you also sending? Are you trying to attract the attention of extraterrestrial civilizations, or are you just receiving at this point?
We just receive. We leave the transmitting to the networks, for example, or the radars down at the local airport, because those put pretty strong signals out into space. We don't broadcast. Part of it is just money, right? There's hardly any money even to receive or try and find a signal that's already arriving. The other thing is you would have to have a lot of patience. If you want to broadcast, right, suppose you broadcast and the nearest society is 500 light years away. It takes 500 years for your inquiry to get there. And if the aliens deign to reply, that's another 500 years before you get the response. Well, after 1,000 years, your personal interest in the project will be somewhat less. So we don't do that.
Now, what if you actually found a signal that indicated it came from intelligent life? What would you do then?
Well, what happens first? We know what happens because we've had some false alarms. So I think we know fairly accurately what would happen if we got a signal. To begin with, you don't know right away. It isn't that you're just sitting there looking bored, and then the next moment, oh, look, a signal, right? It takes days for you to be sure that any given signal is really what you're looking for, really ET and not just more interference. So during all that time, the half a week or a week it would take to verify it, you can be sure the media are, bombarding you with questions because there's no secrecy in this project. So as soon as the signal's found, everybody knows about it. The media will be calling up, we know this happens, and they'll be saying, what about that signal? So that's what would happen right away. There would just be a lot of media coverage and people would want to know more.
But let's say you determined that it looked like it came from an intelligent source. I mean, could you decode it and figure out what the signal was saying?
Well, probably, in fact, overwhelmingly likely is the fact that you would have to build a much larger antenna to go back, look at that same signal source again, a different kind of antenna that would allow you to get the message. Because the message might be, very, very intensive in terms of the bandwidth. I mean, they're not going to send a very slow speed signal like a, Morse code from a ham with a very slow fist. Right? They're going to send something like a TV signal. Well, a TV signal varies about 5 million times a second, right? So you need a different kind of instrument to find that. But if you did, and you got all these bits, what would you do with them? Sure, I think you just put them on the web, put them out there, and let people try and figure out what they're saying.
Now, let's say you never find what you're looking for. Is the project a complete waste, or does it produce other benefits, even if you don't find ETI?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I don't think it's a complete waste because it has led to a lot of very clever people to think about how to do this. And in the course of doing that, they've also thought about other problems that are germane. For example, habitable planets. Now, we talked a little bit about that. I mean, this whole Kepler project, what is that really motivated by? Is it just to find more balls of rocks in space? It's an astronomical question. How many stars have planets sort of like the Earth? Why do we want to know that? We want to know that for one overriding reason. We want to know if we have any cosmic company. So, even if SETI doesn't succeed, it has, in fact, stimulated an awful lot of very interesting research.
Now, one of the early motivations for the whole space program was to find out if there was other life in the solar system, intelligent or not. Now, we've searched all the planets and we haven't found any, not even a microbe. Do you think that affects the odds of finding it in other solar systems, or is that completely irrelevant?
Yeah, no, I think you've called this game too early, actually. We haven't observed, or we haven't explored, all the places where there might be life in our solar system. I mean, we've sent landers in the mid-1970s, the Viking landers to Mars, and they, scraped up some of the dirt and looked at it, and even those results are slightly contentious. Most of the scientists involved concluded that, well, it was dead, Jim, that there was no life in the dirt of Mars. But just a couple of weeks ago, there was the discovery of what looks like water right below the surface of Mars, liquid water, okay, salty water just below the surface. And when I say just below the surface, maybe only that far. So there are missions being planned to go to Mars, and you can just dig down. It doesn't take much of a drill to go a few inches under the surface, pull up that muck and look at it under a microscope. We may yet find life on Mars, but there are 6 other worlds in our solar system that might have liquid water and where there might be life, and we haven't explored any of them.
Now, this gets a little bit into the field of astrobiology, which I think the SETI Institute is also involved in. trying to define the minimum conditions under which life can survive and be created. It's one thing for an environment to be capable of sustaining life. It's different for an environment to generate life. Have you been able to find out anything about what are the conditions to get life started, just because conditions to sustain it are present?
Yeah, well, that's quite right. I mean, if you took, maybe Mars is dead, but if you took all the biota on Earth and just threw it at Mars, you took Noah's Ark, including the microbes, by the way, not just the giraffes and the hippos.
But more than two.
Yeah, that's right. Maybe you need more. You probably only need one of each of the microbes if they can split. But you just throw that all at Mars, right, and you come back a year later. Would any of it still be alive? And the answer to that is, well, apparently yes. Some of the microbes would survive. But that doesn't, just because you might be able to survive on Mars doesn't prove that life could get started on Mars. That's your question. And how can we be sure that just because you have a million worlds which have the conditions that would sustain life, that any of them will produce life? That's a big question for which, unfortunately, there's no definitive answer yet. One thing that's always pointed out, however, is that life got started very quickly on Earth, and that sort of suggests that maybe it isn't hard to get started. But there are people who would even argue with that.
Now, do we want to meet people from extraterrestrial civilizations, assuming they're people? Would that be good for us? Would we benefit from coming into contact with extraterrestrial civilizations, or would that maybe harm us a lot?
Well, we're not talking here about coming into contact, because if we pick up the signal, of course, they don't know that we picked up their signal, so that they're not about to jump into their spaceships and say, well, we've got some, we've got some people that have found us over there. We better come down there and either, buy their used cars or to just destroy the planet, whatever it is they have in mind. I don't know. What you're asking is, if in the case of actual physical contact, close encounters of the third kind.
Like let's say they visit us.
They visit us for whatever reason. I don't know why they would come here, because they don't know about us.
It's a nice place.
It's a nice place. Okay, well, maybe.
An international tourist location.
Well, yeah, maybe they're attracted by the forests of Estonia or something. So they decide to come here. Okay, and they do that. Would they be friendly? I don't know. What you're asking is, what is the behavior of the aliens? And that's alien sociology. And I got to tell you straight out, Marty, we don't have much data on that.
Well, right now, all we can do is project ourselves onto them,
That's right.
which probably isn't that encouraging.
Well, it might not. Might not be. It is true that explorers tend to be fairly aggressive compared with the general populace. If you look at the Spaniards that the Mesoamericans met, the South Americans, the North Americans met, for that matter. I mean, it wasn't always the Spaniards, but they didn't meet your average Spaniard guy who, sells zapatas on the streets of Madrid. What they met were the very aggressive guys who were trying to make a name for themselves and so forth. So, if you think that that is a good analog for how the aliens from other star systems would behave, then maybe it would be dangerous. But the bottom line is, we actually have no idea.
Right. But the idea of searching for life is that we're really hoping to find it. We're not searching in the hope of not finding it, right?
Yes, yes. This is a very asymmetric experiment. It isn't like kind of the science you learned about in junior high school, where you set up an hypothesis. Remember the scientific method, right? Which, as far as I know, no scientists actually follow. But anyhow, the scientific method, you set up a hypothesis, and then you decide an experiment that could prove that hypothesis or falsify that hypothesis. In other words, prove it's not true. You run the experiment, and you might falsify the hypothesis. Oh, well, that idea just doesn't work, and we can throw it out. Okay, that would be a valuable experiment. In the case of looking for life in space, you can not prove that it's not there. There's just no way to do that. You can't prove that. All you can do is hope to prove that it is there.
Yeah. Now, I understand that you've got some new funding lately. There was a newspaper article. You actually had to shut down the array for a while, but some people came through. I think the actor Jodie Foster came through with a nice donation.
Well, Jodie Foster has, in fact, lent her name and her support to this program. It was called SETI Stars, and it's still ongoing in a way. SETI Stars, designed to raise money from the general public, just ordinary folk who think that this is an interesting thing to do. And in 2 months, they wanted to raise $200,000. We succeeded at doing that, and more than succeeded, actually. I have to say I was very gratified by the fact that people, even in a time of economic hardship, find it still interesting to do this. No guarantees of success. We need more money to get the array really going for a while. We're looking for those monies now, and I think that we may get them.
And Jodie Foster was probably interested because she starred in that movie that was about the SETI project.
Contact, yes.
Contact, yeah.
Yeah.
Written by Carl Sagan.
That's right. Based on Carl Sagan's 1983 novel, I believe. And in fact, he was involved in writing the screenplay.
So it's all about publicity.
Well, maybe it is. I don't know that it's about publicity. I think a lot of people actually know about the SETI enterprise. Maybe I'm deluding myself here, but I think that they do. There is always the question of whether they feel that contributing to this project will make a difference. And all I can say is it's a very inexpensive project compared to almost any other research, and small amounts of money do make a difference.
Yeah. Now, we tend to think that if we meet an alien civilization, maybe they're a little bit ahead of us scientifically, but if you look at what the human race has done in, say, 100 years, from the time we first discovered how to use electricity as a source of power till the time we put men on the moon, that's about 100 years. 100 years is nothing in cosmic time. We could have civilizations millions of years ahead of us. If development could proceed uninterrupted for a really long time, there could be extraterrestrial civilizations all around us. Maybe they have a prohibition on making contact, but if the universe is as old as scientists say it is, and if development could proceed uninterrupted in some places, that would seem like plenty of time to cover an awful lot of ground.
Well, there's no doubt about that. I mean, clearly, there are going to be some worlds where life is less advanced than on Earth. But if life is a very common thing, if it springs up on a lot of planets, then most of the planets with life in the universe are older than the Earth. And what's the average age by which they're older? A couple of billion years, right? So if intelligence has arisen on some of those worlds and, develops technology and so forth, I mean, their technology could literally be so far beyond ours that it's really quite difficult for us to kind of imagine what it might be like. Yes.
Let me ask you about the efficacy of your equipment. If you were to take all of your equipment and transport it 50 light years away and point it back at the Earth, do you feel confident that it would detect intelligent life on Earth?
Well, it would be able to detect some things on Earth. Most things it would not be able to detect. The equipment we have would not, for example, pick up our television at that distance. But it would pick up some of the stronger radars. There are radars that are powerful enough. So, radars maybe not all that interesting to look at. But, it would tell you, well, I don't know Zork, but there's something on that little blue-green planet capable of building a powerful transmitter.
But wouldn't the emanations from the sun tend to drown everything out? Because the sun would be practically right next to the Earth, looking at it from that distance.
It would be next to the Earth looking at it from that distance. But remember, the sun hasn't built a radio transmitter. The sun puts out a lot of radio energy, but it's all over the dial. So, the transmitters could drown that out, could easily drown that out. I mean, it's like this. There's plenty of cosmic static, not cosmic static, but just static in your radio caused by the electronics, right? If you tune your AM radio in the old days when you could actually tune it, right? Turn the knob, you would hear static everywhere. But as soon as you got to that country and western station that you're really trying to find, right, then it just completely drowns out that natural static. It would be an equivalent situation to somebody looking at our planet from 50, 100, 1,000 light years away. Yes, there would be some background static due to the sun, but that would be very faint compared to our transmitters. We outshine the sun at certain frequencies.
So do these telescopes constantly search through different frequencies like a radio looking for a hit?
Yeah, indeed. You want to do that because you don't know which frequency you should be examining. But we don't have a knob, that, as it were, is sort of mechanically tuned or even electronically tuned, where we just, tune through the dial. Because if you do that, then you're spending all your time at the wrong frequency somehow, right? So what you want to do is you want to be able to listen to all those frequencies at once. That's the intention of the kind of receivers we build.
Is it important to us that we not be alone in the universe? Do we not want to be alone? Maybe it's better to be alone in the universe.
Well, Marty, I don't know. I don't want to intrude on your personal philosophies. I mean, I don't know whether it's better or not. I personally think it would be very interesting to know that we're not alone. Up to this point, we're the crown of creation. By self-definition, right? This is it. This is what God intended. That, well, it would be very interesting to find that we're not the only kids on the block. And not only that, any other kids you find, after all, this argument that you made earlier, any other kids you find are going to be more advanced than we are. Otherwise, you're not going to find them. Consequently, is that interesting? Yes, because I think it calibrates us. It tells us, we're interesting, we're unique, we are unique, but we're not a miracle. We're not a miracle.
Can we learn anything about ourselves by studying extraterrestrial life?
Well, you might. I mean, if you found extraterrestrial life on Mars, for example, it might even be related to us. It may be that Mars infected the Earth. Maybe you'd learn something about biology that way. If it wasn't related to us, maybe you would learn something about what biology can do in other circumstances. That might be interesting, too. It's not DNA-based. It's Q&A-based or whatever. I mean, there's certain research goals that would be served by finding life elsewhere. But I think that in terms of our culture, which is after all what's special about humans, you might learn something if you could understand their message. Because if they're, 100,000 years ahead of you, they might tell you some really interesting stuff. Here's all physics, here's all astronomy, here's the cure for death, here's how to get along, whatever they're going to tell you.
Or maybe greed and desire for dominion are just as powerful at the intergalactic level as they are here.
It might be. Darwinian evolution probably obtains everywhere.
Yeah. So it could be that they'll be just like ourselves, but a little more advanced and have better tools.
That's possible. I think it's more likely that it goes in a different direction, because I think that we will go in a different direction within a century or two by inventing artificial intelligence. And if you really do that, then that proceeds to evolve much more quickly than biology. And it may be that the aliens have done the same thing, so that if we pick up a signal, it's actually coming from machines, not, protoplasmic aliens.
Yeah. There's a big question about whether life on Earth really is special. I mean, if life can exist here, you would sort of assume that it could probably exist elsewhere, but we don't really know that, until we find it. Would this change the way we think of ourselves and our position in the universe?
Well, I think it does. As I say, I think that simply knowing that there's something else out there, that what has happened here on Earth happened elsewhere. If you find it one other place, of course, it's like finding one elephant. And if you find a second elephant, you can be sure there are lots and lots of elephants. So if we find another instance of intelligent life, you can be sure the universe is rife with intelligent life. And I think that that's interesting, because, again, it's like asking, well, what was the function of Copernicus pointing out that the Earth wasn't the center of the cosmos? How did that affect me? I still went to work every day, right? But it really does affect you.
We're almost out of time, so let me just ask you one more question. Do you feel personally optimistic that you will see evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence in your lifetime?
Well, I am personally sanguine about that. Yes, Marty, I hope so. I mean, I might get hit by a bus tomorrow, and that would probably reduce my chances a bit. But honestly, if you look at the speed at which the searches are improving, they're following what's called Moore's Law, something well known to this program, I'm sure. And consequently, I think the next 20 years could prove to be the amount of time required to pick up a signal.
Okay, and we're going to have to break on that note because we are out of time. This is Marty Wasserman for Future Talk. See you next time.